The morning sun cast long shadows across the Miller farm as 25-year-old Sarah Miller hung the last of the washing on the line. Her movements were mechanical, practiced from years of the same routine, but her heart carried a weight that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. "Sarah," her mother's voice cut through the crisp October air like a blade. "Come inside, now." Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pinned the final sheet to the line. She knew that tone. It was the same one her mother had used 3 months ago, when the whispers first started. When Mrs. Yoder claimed she'd seen Sarah walking with an English boy near the covered bridge after dark. It wasn't true. None of it was true. But in their small Amish community of Cedar Valley, truth often mattered less than perception, and perception had already condemned her. Sarah walked slowly toward the white farmhouse where she'd been born, where she'd learned to cook and sew and tend to the animals, where she'd dreamed of one day bringing her own husband and children. Those dreams felt like autumn leaves now, beautiful once, but crumbling at the touch. Inside, her father, Moses Miller, sat at the kitchen table, with his head in his hands. Her mother, Rebecca, stood by the window, her back rigid as a fence post. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. "Sit down, Sarah," her father said without looking up. She remained standing. "What is it now?" "Thomas Schrock came by this morning," her mother said, still facing the window. "He's withdrawing his courtship request." Sarah's heart sank, though she'd been expecting this. Thomas was the 4th young man in 3 months to back away from any romantic interest. The pattern had become painfully familiar, he said. Her father's voice cracked slightly. He said, "His parents won't allow him to court a woman with a reputation." "What reputation?" Sarah's voice rose despite her attempt to stay calm. "I've done nothing wrong. I've never even held hands with a man, let alone—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The accusation was too painful to voice. Her mother finally turned around, and Sarah was shocked to see tears in her eyes. Rebecca Miller was not a woman who cried easily. "It doesn't matter what you've done or haven't done," her mother whispered. "What matters is what people believe, and they believe you've been inappropriate with that English boy from town. His name is David, and he was only asking for directions to the Henderson farm. I spoke to him for maybe 2 minutes. Mrs. Yoder says she saw you laughing with him. She says it looked intimate." Sarah felt the familiar surge of helpless frustration. Since when is laughter a sin? Since when is basic kindness to a stranger cause for shunning? "You're not being shunned," her father said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Aren't I?" Sarah's voice grew stronger. "When was the last time anyone sat with me at Sunday service? When was the last time I was invited to a quilting bee or a barn raise? When was the last time anyone in this community looked me in the eye?" Her parents exchanged a glance that spoke volumes. They knew she was right. "Maybe it would be best," her mother said carefully, "if you went to stay with your Aunt Martha in Ohio for a while. Until things settle down. You want to send me away?" "It wasn't a question. We want to protect you," her father said, finally meeting her eyes. "And maybe give people time to forget." "Forget what?" "The lie that's ruining my life." Sarah turned and walked out of the kitchen, through the parlor where her hope chest sat gathering dust, and up the narrow stairs to her bedroom. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wedding dress hanging in her wardrobe. The one her grandmother had sewn, the one her mother had worn, the one Sarah had dreamed of wearing at her own wedding. It might as well be a burial shroud now. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Her younger sister Ruth peeked inside. At 19, Ruth was everything Sarah used to be. Hopeful, innocent, beloved by the community. She was also the only person who still treated Sarah like a human being. "I don't believe them," Ruth said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I know you, Sarah. I know your heart." Sarah felt tears sting her eyes. "Thank you. But your belief doesn't change anything." "Maybe not. But there has to be something you can do. Someone who would listen." Sarah laughed bitterly. Like who? Every unmarried man in the community has been warned away from me. The married men won't even speak to me for fear their wives will think they're being improper. The church elders believe I'm a corrupting influence. Who exactly is going to listen to me, Ruth? Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then, hesitantly, she said, "What about Jacob Brenneman?" Sarah looked up sharply. "What about him?" "Well, he's different. He doesn't seem to care much what other people think. And he's alone." Jacob Brenneman. Sarah knew him by sight. Of course, everyone in Cedar Valley knew the tall, broad-shouldered farmer who lived on the old Brenneman homestead at the edge of town. He was a man of few words and fewer smiles, whose wife had died in childbirth 3 years ago, along with their baby. He kept to himself mostly, attending church but rarely socializing, working his farm alone when tradition dictated that such tasks should be shared among neighbors. He was also the only man in the community who had never looked at Sarah with either desire or judgment. He simply looked through her, as if she didn't exist at all. "Jacob Brenneman barely acknowledges my existence," Sarah said. "Why would he care about my problems?" "Maybe that's exactly why he would listen," Ruth suggested. "He's got no reason to judge you and no reputation to protect by avoiding you." Sarah stood and walked to her window, looking out over the rolling hills that had been her whole world for 25 years. In the distance she could see the smoke rising from Jacob Brenneman's chimney, a thin grey line against the pale October sky. "Even if he would listen," she said, "what would I say? Please believe I'm innocent of something I never did with someone I barely met. What man would want to involve himself in such a mess?" "A good man," Ruth said simply. "And despite what people say about him being strange or cold, I think Jacob Brenneman is a good man. He's just hurt." Sarah turned back to her sister. "What do you mean?" "Think about it, Sarah. He lost everything 3 years ago. His wife, his child, his future. People say he's gotten cold and distant, but maybe he's just protecting himself from more pain." It was true that Jacob had changed after his wife's death. Sarah remembered him from before, not well, as he was 20 years her senior, but she remembered him as a man who smiled more, who participated in community events, who seemed to have hope in his eyes. The Jacob Brenneman of today was a shadow of that man. "Even if you're right about him being good underneath," Sarah said, "why would he want to take on someone else's troubles? He has enough of his own." "Maybe," Ruth said thoughtfully, "that's exactly why he would understand." That evening Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Ruth's words echoing in her mind. Could her sister be right? Was Jacob Brenneman's isolation born of pain rather than coldness? And if so, might he be the one person in Cedar Valley who could see past the community's judgment to the truth of who she really was? The more she thought about it, the more desperate her situation became clear to her. She was 25 years old, unmarried, and effectively shunned by her community. Her parents wanted to send her away, which would only confirm everyone's suspicions about her guilt. The few friends she'd had were pulling away under pressure from their families. Even the children were being warned not to play with her. She was becoming a ghost in her own life. But Jacob Brenneman was already a ghost. Maybe that was exactly what she needed. Someone who understood what it meant to live on the edges of the community. Someone who had nothing left to lose. The idea that began forming in her mind was scandalous, desperate, and completely contrary to everything she'd been taught about proper courtship. But then again, proper courtship had failed her. Every man who had approached her through traditional channels had eventually retreated under community pressure. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to be as bold as she was desperate. As the clock in the parlor chimed midnight, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. Tomorrow she would do something no Amish woman was supposed to do. She would approach a man directly, speak to him without a chaperone, and ask him for something that went against every social convention she'd ever known. Tomorrow she would go to Jacob Brenneman's farm, and she would ask him to save her life. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud as Sarah made her way across the frost-covered fields toward the Brenneman farm. She had left before dawn, before her parents could ask questions, carrying nothing but her courage and a loaf of fresh bread as an excuse for the visit. Her heart hammered against her ribs with each step. What she was about to do went against everything she'd been taught about propriety, courtship, and a woman's place in their community. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem necessary. The Brenneman farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road, isolated from the cluster of homes that made up the heart of Cedar Valley. It was a sturdy two-story structure, well-maintained but somehow hollow-looking, as if the life had drained out of it along with its inhabitants. Sarah paused at the wooden gate, her resolve wavering. Through the kitchen window she could see a figure moving about, Jacob, preparing for his day. Even from a distance, there was something solitary about his movements, a man going through the motions of living without really living. Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah pushed through the gate and walked up the stone path to the front door. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if he simply closed the door in her face? What if he'd already heard the rumors and wanted nothing to do with her? The door opened before she could knock. Jacob Brenneman stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair showing threads of grey at the temples. His deep blue eyes held surprise, and something else, wariness perhaps. He wore work clothes, simple and practical, and there was flour on his hands from preparing breakfast. "Miss Miller," his voice was deep, carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." Sarah realized she was staring. Up close, Jacob was more imposing than she'd remembered, but also more tired. Lines of grief had etched themselves around his eyes, and there was a sadness in his bearing that spoke of burdens carried alone. "Mr. Brenneman," she managed, I brought you some bread." She held out the loaf like a shield. He looked down at the bread, then back at her face. "That's kind of you. But I suspect you didn't walk 2 miles through wet grass just to deliver baked goods." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "No, may I speak with you, please?" For a long moment, Jacob studied her face. She saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in his eyes. Not recognition of her, but of her situation. He'd heard the whispers too. "I suppose you'd better come in," he said finally, stepping aside. The interior of the Brenneman house was clean and sparse, everything in its place but somehow lifeless. Sarah noticed the absence of small touches that marked a woman's presence. No flowers, no decorative quilts, no signs of warmth beyond basic function. It was the home of a man who was surviving, not living. "Coffee?" Jacob asked, gesturing toward the kitchen table. "Yes, thank you." They sat in silence while Jacob poured 2 cups of strong black coffee. Sarah noticed his hands, large, capable, scarred from years of farm work. They shook slightly as he set her cup down, and she wondered if he was nervous too, or if it was something else. "So," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "what brings Sarah Miller to my door at dawn?" Sarah took a sip of coffee to buy herself time. The words she'd practiced in her mind all night suddenly seemed inadequate. "I need to ask you something," she began. "Something that might sound improper." Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening. You've heard the talk about me, haven't you? The rumor. I don't pay much attention to gossip, but you've heard them." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I've heard that some people have questions about your associations." Sarah laughed bitterly. "My associations? That's a delicate way to put it." She met his eyes directly. "They think I've been carrying on with an English boy. They think I'm ruined. Are you?" The question was asked without judgment, as if he were asking about the weather. "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "I spoke to him once, for maybe 2 minutes, to give him directions. That's all. But Miss Yoda saw us talking, saw me smile, and decided it was something more." Jacob nodded slowly. "Esther Yoda sees scandal in a sunrise if she looks hard enough." "You believe me?" Sarah couldn't hide her surprise. I have no reason not to. More importantly, I have no investment in whether you're guilty or innocent. Your reputation doesn't affect my standing in the community. There was a bitter edge to his words. I don't have much standing left to lose. Sarah felt a flicker of hope. That's actually why I'm here. Oh, she took a deep breath. This was the moment. Every eligible man in the community has rejected me. My parents want to send me away to Ohio. I'll be 26 soon, and if I leave now, I'll never be able to come back and marry within the faith. I'll be an old maid, dependent on relatives for the rest of my life. Jacob waited, his expression unreadable. You're alone, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. You have been for 3 years. You need. That is, a man needs. She faltered, feeling heat rise in her cheeks again. A man needs what, Miss Miller? A wife, she said in a rush. A man needs a wife. And I need a husband. We could help each other. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Jacob stared at her with those deep blue eyes, and Sarah felt as if he were looking straight through to her soul. Let me understand this correctly, he said finally. You're proposing marriage to a man you barely know because no one else will have you. Put so bluntly it sounded awful. When you say it like that, how else should I say it? Sarah set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. I know how it sounds. I know it's improper and desperate and probably shocking. But I'm out of options, Mr. Brenneman. In 2 weeks, my father is putting me on a train to Ohio. If I go, my life here is over. Everything I've ever known, everyone I've ever loved, gone. She stood up abruptly, beginning to pace the small kitchen. I know we don't know each other well, but I know you're a good man. I know you're honest and hard-working and faithful to God. I know you lost your wife and child, and I know that loss has left you alone when no man should have to be alone. Jacob remained seated, but she could see something shifting in his expression. I'm not asking for love, Sarah continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. I'm not asking for romance or passion or any of the things young girls dream about. I'm asking for partnership. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the woman the gossips say I am. I'm asking for a home where I can belong. She stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. I can cook and clean and tend a garden. I can help with the farm work. I can make this house feel like a home again instead of just a place where you're waiting to die. Jacob flinched at those last words, and Sarah realized she'd struck closer to the truth than she'd intended. I can be a good wife to you, she finished quietly. All I'm asking is for the chance to try. The silence stretched between them again. Jacob stared down at his hands, and Sarah watched his face, trying to read the emotions flickering across his features. She saw surprise, consideration, pain, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Why me? He asked finally. Why not go to Ohio and start fresh? Find someone there who doesn't know about the rumors. Because this is my home, Sarah said simply. These are my people, even if they've turned their backs on me. This is where my family is, where my sister is. I don't want to run away and hide. I want to stay and prove them wrong. And you think marrying me would do that? I think marrying you would give me the chance to do that. As your wife, I'd have a place in the community again. People respect you, Mr. Brenneman, even if they don't understand you. They'd have to accept me if I were Mrs. Brenneman. Jacob stood up slowly, walking to the window that looked out over his fields. You don't know me, Sarah. You don't know what kind of man I really am. Then tell me. He was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not the man I used to be. Before Martha died, before we lost the baby, I was different. I laughed more. I cared about things. I had hope. He turned to look at her. That man died with them. What's left is just function. Going through the motions. Sarah felt her heart clench at the pain in his voice. Maybe that's enough for now. Is it? Is it end for you to tie yourself to a man who might never love you, who might never be more than just a roof over your head and food on your table? Sarah walked to the window and stood beside him, looking out at the rolling hills and endless. My other choice is to have no roof at all, and to spend the rest of my life as a burden to relatives who'll never let me forget what a disappointment I am. So yes, Mr. Brenneman, it's enough." They stood in silence, two broken people considering a bargain born of desperation and loneliness. "I won't pretend to love you," Jacob said finally. "I'm not asking you to. I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. I wouldn't want you to. I'm set in my ways. I like quiet. I don't entertain much. That sounds peaceful." Jacob turned to look at her, studying her face with those penetrating blue eyes. "You're serious about this? Completely? Even knowing that people will say you threw yourself at the first man who would take you?" Sarah's chin lifted defiantly. "Let them say it. I know the truth, and so will you." For the first time since she'd arrived, Jacob's expression softened slightly. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than the careful neutrality he'd maintained. "You're either very brave or very foolish," he said. "Probably both." Jacob was quiet for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right." Sarah's heart stopped. "All right. I'll marry you, Sarah Miller. God knows this house could use a woman's touch again. And he paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I'm tired of being alone." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "You will? You really will?" "I will, but we do this properly. I'll speak to your father today, ask for your hand the right way. We'll be married in the church with the whole community present. No one will have cause to say this wasn't done with honor and respect." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you so much." Jacob nodded curtly, already seeming to regret his decision. "You should go now, before people start talking about you being here unchaperoned." Sarah moved toward the door, then turned back. "Mr. Brenneman, Jacob, I want you to know I'll be a good wife to you. I promise." For just a moment, something vulnerable flickered in his eyes. "I hope I can be a good husband to you, Sarah. I'm not sure I remember how. We'll figure it together," she said softly. As Sarah walked back across the misty fields toward home, her heart was lighter than it had been in months. She'd done it. She'd found a way to stay in Cedar Valley, to keep her place in the community, to prove her innocence. She'd also committed herself to a man she barely knew, a man who'd openly admitted he might never love her. But as she thought about the pain she'd seen in Jacob's eyes, the loneliness that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fire, Sarah realized something that surprised her. She wanted to help him heal, not just for her own sake, but for his. She wanted to bring life back to that empty house, warmth back to those sad blue eyes. Maybe this marriage of convenience could become something more after all. Maybe they could save each other. The news of Jacob Brenneman's request to marry Sarah Miller spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire through dry wheat. By evening, it seemed every household in the community was buzzing with shock, speculation and scandal. Sarah sat in her family's parlor, watching her parents' faces as they processed what Jacob had told them that afternoon. Her father had been chopping wood behind the barn when Jacob arrived, and Sarah had watched from her bedroom window as the two men talked in low, serious tones for nearly an hour. "I still can't believe it," her mother said for the fifth time, wringing her hands in her apron. "Jacob Brenneman's. Of all people, he's a good man, Rebecca," Moses said quietly, though his brow was furrowed with concern. "A respected man. This could be the answer to our prayers, or it could be the beginning of more trouble," Rebecca replied. "People are going to say Sarah seduced him, that she used her feminine wiles to trap a grieving widower." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I didn't seduce anyone, Mama. I simply asked if he might consider marriage as a practical arrangement." "You asked him?" Rebecca's voice rose an octave. "Sarah Elizabeth Miller, you went to a man's house alone and proposed marriage?" "I had no choice. Every proper suitor has rejected me because of lies and gossip. What was I supposed to do, sit here and wait for you to ship me off to a higher?" Moses held up a hand for silence. "What's done is done. Jacob has asked for Sarah's hand. I've given my blessing, and the banns will be announced on Sunday. The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. 3 weeks? Rebecca looked stricken. That's so fast. People will count the months when the first child comes. They'll assume. Let them assume what they want, Sarah interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. I'm tired of living my life based on what other people might think. Ruth, who had been quietly listening from the corner, finally spoke up. I think it's romantic. All three adults turned to stare at her. Romantic, Rebecca sputtered. Yes, Ruth said firmly. Like in the Bible, when Ruth went to Boaz and asked him to be her kinsman redeemer. Sometimes God uses desperate circumstances to bring people together who are meant to be together. Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward her younger sister, but before she could respond, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted them. Moses went to answer it, returning moments later with Bishop Stoltzfus and Deacon Yoder, Esther Yoder's husband. Sarah's heart sank. If the church elders were here, it meant the situation had escalated beyond family gossip. Good evening, Moses, Rebecca, Bishop Stoltzfus said, his lined face grave. He was a tall, thin man with a white beard that reached nearly to his chest, and his presence always rose to fill whatever room he entered. We need to speak with you about your daughter's situation. Please sit, Moses gestured toward the chairs. Would you like coffee? This isn't a social call, Deacon Yoder said curtly. He was a shorter, rounder man, with small, sharp eyes that always seemed to be looking for fault. We're here because the community is in an uproar over this sudden engagement. Sarah straightened her shoulders. Why should my engagement cause an uproar? I'm marrying a respected member of the community. You're marrying a man you barely know, Deacon Yoder snapped, after spending months under suspicion of improper behavior. It looks calculated. Calculated. Sarah stood up, her temper flaring. What exactly are you implying, Deacon Yoder? Bishop Stoltzfus held up a weathered hand. What Deacon Yoder is trying to say, child, is that the timing raises questions. The community is wondering if perhaps there are circumstances that make this marriage necessary. The implication hit Sarah like a slap. You think I'm with child, are you? Deacon Yoder leaned forward, his eyes glittering with something that looked almost like anticipation. No, Sarah's voice rang out clear and strong. I am not with child. I have never been intimate with any man, and I resent the accusation. Sarah, her father warned quietly. No, Papa, I won't be quiet anymore. I'm tired of having my character assassinated by people who should know better. She turned to face the church elders directly. I went to Jacob Brenneman and asked him to consider marriage because I had no other choice. Every eligible man in this community has rejected me based on a lie that started with Mrs. Yoder's overactive imagination and spread like poison through our community. Deacon Yoder's face reddened. My wife is a God-fearing woman who your wife Sarah interrupted, saw me give directions to a lost English boy, and decided I must be having an affair with him. She took 2 minutes of Christian kindness and turned it into months of torment for me and my family. Sarah, please, Bishop Stoltzfus said gently. Your anger is understandable, but is it? Sarah's voice broke slightly. Is it understandable, Bishop? Because for 3 months I've been treated like a pariah in my own community. I've been shunned, whispered about, and rejected by everyone I thought cared about me. And now, when I finally find someone willing to give me a chance at a normal life, you come here questioning my motives and my morals. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. All the hurt and frustration and loneliness of the past months came pouring out. I love this community, she continued. These people are my family, my friends, my whole world. But they turned their backs on me based on gossip and assumption. Jacob Brenneman is the only person who was willing to look past the rumors and see me as a human being deserving of respect and a chance at happiness. The room fell silent except for Sarah's quiet sobs. Ruth moved to put an arm around her sister's shoulders. While their parents looked on with a mixture of pride and concern, Bishop Stoltzfus studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then turned to her parents. Has she been examined by a midwife? Moses stiffened. That won't be necessary. Actually, Sarah said, wiping her eyes, it will be. If that's what it takes to prove my innocence, then I'll submit to an examination. I have nothing to hide. Deacon Yoder looked disappointed, as if he'd been hoping for a different response. Very well, Bishop Stoltzfors said slowly. I'll arrange for midwife Schmidt to examine you tomorrow. If she confirms your purity, then the church will have no objection to your marriage to Jacob Brenneman. And if she doesn't, Sarah asked, though she knew the answer, then you'll be shunned completely, and Jacob will be strongly counseled to withdraw his proposal. Sarah nodded. I understand. After the elders left, the Miller family sat in heavy silence. Sarah felt drained, as if the confrontation had taken all her strength. You were very brave tonight, Ruth said softly. Was I, or was I just foolish? Brave, Moses said firmly. I'm proud of you, daughter. You stood up for yourself with dignity. I hope Jacob doesn't change his mind, Sarah whispered. If he withdraws his proposal now, he won't, Rebecca said with more confidence than Sarah had heard in her voice for months. I saw him when he came to speak with your father. He's not a man who makes decisions lightly or changes his mind easily. The next morning, Sarah submitted to the humiliating examination by midwife Schmidt, an elderly woman who had delivered half the babies in Cedar Valley. The process was uncomfortable and embarrassing, but Sarah endured it with as much dignity as she could muster. When it was over, midwife Schmidt nodded briskly. You're intact, child, completely untouched. Anyone who says otherwise is a liar. Sarah felt weak with relief. Thank you. Don't thank me for speaking the truth. But I will say this. You're marrying a good man. Jacob Brenneman has suffered more than his share of loss, but he's got a good heart underneath all that sadness. Be patient with him. I will be. That afternoon, Jacob came to the Miller farm to discuss wedding arrangements. He looked tired, and Sarah suspected he'd been dealing with his own of community pressure. Are you having second thoughts? She asked when they were alone on the front porch. Are you? I asked first. Jacob almost smiled at that. No, I'm not having second thoughts, though I'll admit I wasn't expecting quite this level of attention. People have been talking to you, Bishop Stoltzfus, Deacon Yoder, half the men in the district. Jacob's jaw tightened. They all seem very concerned about my sudden decision to remarry. And what did you tell them? I told them it was none of their business. This time he did smile, just a little. I also told them that I'd found a woman of good character who would make a suitable wife, and that anyone who thought otherwise could keep their opinions to themselves. Sarah felt a warm flutter in her chest. You defended me. Of course I did. You're going to be my wife. The simple statement carried more weight than any flowery declaration of affection could have. Sarah was going to be his wife. He would protect her, defend her, stand by her. It wasn't love, but it was something solid and real. Jacob, she said softly, I heard about the midwife's examination. About what she confirmed. He nodded. I never doubted you. You didn't. No. I told you before, I don't have much use for gossip. I judge people by their actions, not by what others say about them. Your actions yesterday, coming to me with honesty and courage, told me everything I needed to know about your character. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different tears. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me a reason to care about something again. The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the farmyard. 3 weeks, Jacob said finally. 3 weeks, Sarah agreed. Are you ready for this? Really ready? Because once we're married, there's no going back. You'll be tied to a man who might never be the husband you deserve. Sarah turned to look at him, taking in his strong profile, the sadness that seemed permanently etched around his eyes, the way his hands gripped the porch railing, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. Jacob, she said gently, What if I'm not looking for the husband I deserve? What if I'm looking for the husband you need me to help you become? He turned to meet her gaze, and for just a moment, Sarah saw something flicker in those blue depths. Surprise, hope, maybe even the faintest spark of something that could, someday, become love. You might be disappointed, he said quietly. I might surprise you, she replied. 3 weeks later, on a crisp November morning with frost sparkling on the bare tree branches, Sarah Elizabeth Miller would become Sarah Elizabeth Brenneman. The whole community would witness it, some with approval, others with speculation, and a few with barely concealed disappointment that their juiciest scandal had ended so respectably. But that morning was still to come. For now, there were preparations to make, a dress to alter, and a heart to prepare for a future that was uncertain, but finally blessedly hopeful. As Jacob stood to leave, he paused at the porch steps. Sarah? Yes? I want you to know, I'll do my best to be a good husband to you. I may not know how anymore, but I'll try. That's all either of us can do, she said softly. Try, and trust God with the rest. Jacob nodded and walked away, his tall figure growing smaller as he headed back toward his lonely farm. But somehow, Sarah thought, it wouldn't be lonely much longer. In 3 weeks, 2 broken people would stand before God and their community and promise to build a life together. It wasn't the fairy tale Sarah had dreamed of as a girl, but maybe it was something better. Maybe it was real. The morning of November 15th dawned clear and cold, with a thin layer of frost covering the ground like crystallized tears. Sarah stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun rise over the hills that would soon no longer be the view from her childhood home. In 4 hours she would be married. Sarah? Ruth's voice came softly from behind her. Mama says it's time to get dressed. Sarah turned from the window, taking one last look at the room where she'd spent 25 years of her life. Her hope chest sat open in the corner, nearly empty now, its contents packed and ready to be moved to the Brenneman farm. The wedding dress hung from the wardrobe door, pristine white cotton, with delicate hand-sewn details that had taken her grandmother months to complete. I'm ready, Sarah said, though her voice shook slightly. Ruth helped her into the dress, fastening the tiny buttons that ran up the back with practiced fingers. Their mother had worn this same dress, as had their grandmother, and someday, God willing, Ruth would wear it too. The weight of tradition felt heavy on Sarah's shoulders. You look beautiful, Ruth whispered, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Like an angel. Sarah looked at herself in the small mirror above her dresser. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing her small waist and modest curves. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, covered by the white prayer cap that marked her as a woman of faith. She did look beautiful, but more than that, she looked like a bride ready to start a new life. Do you think he'll think so? Sarah asked softly. Jacob? Oh, Sarah, the way he looked at you after church last Sunday. I think he's beginning to see you as more than just a practical arrangement. Sarah hoped Ruth was right. Over the past 3 weeks, Jacob had visited regularly to discuss household arrangements and wedding plans. He'd been unfailingly polite and considerate, but also distant, as if he were afraid to let his guard down completely. Still, Sarah had caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not love, not yet, but something warmer than mere tolerance. Girls, Rebecca's voice called from downstairs. The carriages are arriving. Sarah's stomach fluttered with nervous butterflies. In the past 3 weeks, the community's attitude toward her had begun to shift. Midwife Schmidt's confirmation of her purity, combined with Jacob's steadfast defense of her character, had gradually worn down the worst of the gossip. People were still curious, still whispering, but the cruel speculation had largely died away. The ride to the church was a blur of familiar faces lining the road, some waving, others simply watching with interest. Sarah sat between her parents in the front carriage, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Are you nervous, daughter? Moses asked, gently. Terrified, Sarah admitted. That's normal, Rebecca said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. I was so nervous on my wedding day that I nearly fainted during the vows. Really? Really? But the moment your father took my hand and smiled at me, all the fear melted away. You'll see, when you look into Jacob's eyes and see that he's chosen you, truly chosen you, everything else will fade away. Sarah prayed her mother was right. The church was packed, every bench filled with members of the community who had come to witness this most unusual union. Sarah could feel the weight of their stares as she walked down the center aisle on her father's arm, her eyes fixed straight ahead, on the altar where Bishop Stoltzfus waited with his Bible open. And there, standing tall and solemn in his best black suit, was Jacob. He turned as she approached, and their eyes met. Sarah felt her breath catch. He looked handsome, more handsome than she'd ever seen him. But it was the expression in his eyes that made her knees weak. There was no distance there, no careful politeness. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was really going to be his wife. Moses placed Sarah's hand in Jacob's, and she felt the strength and warmth of his fingers closing around hers. His hands were slightly rough from farm work, but his grip was gentle and steady. "Dearly beloved," Bishop Stoltzfus began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Jacob Brenneman and Sarah Miller in holy matrimony." The familiar words washed over Sarah, but she found herself focused entirely on Jacob's face. He was looking down at her with an intensity that made her feel as if they were the only two people in the room. When the bishop asked if there were any objections to the marriage, Sarah held her breath, half expecting someone to speak up. But the church remained silent. "Jacob Brenneman," Bishop Stoltzfus continued, "do you take Sarah Miller to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Jacob's voice was strong and clear. "And do you, Sarah Miller, take Jacob Brenneman to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Sarah looked up into Jacob's blue eyes and saw her future there, uncertain perhaps, but no longer lonely. "I do. Then by the power vested in me by God and this community, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride." Jacob hesitated for just a moment, and Sarah saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. Then gently he cupped her cheek with his free hand and leaned down to brush his lips against hers. It was a chaste kiss appropriate for a church wedding, but Sarah felt a jolt of electricity at the contact. When they broke apart, she saw something new in Jacob's eyes, a spark of genuine warmth that hadn't been there before. The congregation erupted in applause, and suddenly Sarah found herself being hugged and congratulated by what felt like half of Cedar Valley. The women who had been whispering about her for months now embraced her warmly, welcoming her into the ranks of married women with genuine smiles. "Miss Brenneman," Esther Yoder said, appearing at Sarah's side with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "What a lovely ceremony. I do hope you'll be very happy." "Thank you, Miss Yoder," Sarah replied politely, though inwardly she marveled at the woman's ability to act as if she hadn't been the source of all Sarah's troubles. The reception was held at the Miller farm, with long tables set up in the barn and enough food to feed an army. Sarah sat beside Jacob at the head table, acutely aware of his presence beside her. He was making an effort to socialize, accepting congratulations and making polite conversation, but she could see the strain around his eyes. This level of social interaction was difficult for him. "Are you all right?" she whispered during a lull in the conversation. "I'm fine, just not used to being the center of attention. We can leave soon if you'd like." Jacob glanced at her with something that might have been gratitude. "I'd appreciate that, but not too soon. I don't want to appear rude." They stayed through the traditional dances and the cutting of the wedding cake that Ruth had spent days decorating. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah noticed Jacob beginning to relax slightly. Several men drew him into conversations about farming and livestock, topics that seemed to put him more at ease. Finally, as the sun began to set, it was time for the traditional departure of the bride and groom. Sarah hugged her family goodbye, trying not to cry as she embraced Ruth. "Be happy," Ruth whispered in her ear. "And be patient. I think he's going to surprise you." Sarah climbed into Jacob's buggy for the ride to what was now her home. They rode in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thoughts, as the familiar landscape rolled past in the golden light of late afternoon. "How do you feel?" Jacob asked as they turned into his driveway. "Like a married woman," Sarah said, then laughed at how strange the words sounded. "How do you feel?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Different," he said finally. "Good different, I think, but different." The Brenneman farm looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks ago, but somehow it felt entirely changed to Sarah. This was her home now, her responsibility, her future. Jacob helped her down from the buggy, and they stood together in the dooryard, both suddenly awkward now that they were alone. "I've prepared the bedroom for you," Jacob said, his cheeks reddening slightly. "The bed is fresh, and I moved some things around to make room for your belongings." Sarah felt her own face heat up. They'd never really discussed the physical aspects of their marriage, but she assumed that Jacob, having been married before, would expect certain things. "Jacob," she said carefully, "about tonight, I know we discussed this being a practical arrangement, but you are my husband now, and if you want to, that is, if you expect—" "Sarah," Jacob's voice was gentle, but firm. "I meant what I said about not pretending feelings I don't have. I won't force anything on you that you're not ready for. We have time to figure things out." Sarah felt a rush of relief, mixed with something that might have been disappointment. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for giving me patience to give." They carried Sarah's belongings into the house, and Jacob showed her around, pointing out where things were kept and explaining the household routines. The master bedroom was awkward territory. It had clearly been redecorated recently, with new curtains and a colorful quilt that definitely hadn't been there before. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "You didn't have to go to so much trouble. I wanted you to feel welcome." That night, they lay in the same bed but on opposite sides, a careful space maintained between them. Sarah stared at the ceiling, hyper-aware of Jacob's breathing beside her, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the strange intimacy of sharing a bed with a man she barely knew. Jacob's voice came quietly through the darkness.
"Yes?"
"I want you to know, having you here, it already feels different. The house feels alive again." Sarah turned on her side to face him, though she could barely make out his profile in the darkness. "I'm glad. I know this isn't what you dreamed of when you were a girl. Marrying a man who can't promise you love, living in a house that still holds memories of another woman." "Jacob, let me finish. I can't promise you love, but I can promise you respect. I can promise you faithfulness and protection and partnership, and maybe someday there could be more." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "That's more than I dared hope for." They fell asleep that way, facing each other across the careful space between them, and Sarah's last thought before drifting off was that maybe, just maybe, they were going to be all right. The next morning, Sarah woke early and made breakfast, filling the kitchen with the smells of bacon and fresh biscuits. When Jacob came downstairs, she saw him pause in the doorway, taking in the scene, the table set for two, the coffee pot bubbling on the stove, the warm golden light streaming through windows that sparkled from a thorough cleaning. "Good morning, husband," Sarah said softly. Jacob's face transformed with the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Good morning, wife." And for the first time since her world had been turned upside down by malicious gossip, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. They were married now, for better or worse, and looking at Jacob's smile, Sarah couldn't help but think it was going to be much more better than either of them had expected. Winter settled over Cedar Valley like a heavy quilt, blanketing the Brenneman farm in pristine snow that transformed the stark landscape into something almost magical. Sarah had been married for 6 weeks now, and the rhythm of married life was beginning to feel natural. Every morning she rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, finding a quiet satisfaction in the domestic routine she'd dreamed of her entire life. Jacob was an early riser too, usually heading out to tend the animals before the sun crested the hills. They would eat together in companionable silence, discussing the day's tasks and sharing observations about the weather or the neighbors. It was a peaceful existence, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Jacob was still holding himself at arm's length, as if he were afraid to fully embrace this new chapter of his life. This morning was different, though. Sarah woke to the sound of Jacob moving restlessly beside her, and when she turned to look at him in the pale pre-dawn light, she saw that his face was contorted with distress. He was dreaming, she realized, and from the way his hands clutched at the bedsheets, it wasn't a pleasant dream. "Martha," he whispered, his voice thick with anguish. "Martha, please don't go." Sarah's heart clenched. Even in sleep, Jacob was haunted by the loss of his first wife. She watched him struggle against the nightmare, torn between wanting to comfort him and not wanting to intrude on his private grief. "The baby," Jacob moaned. "I couldn't save the baby. That decided it." Sarah gently touched his shoulder. "Jacob, Jacob, wake up." His eyes flew open, wild and disoriented. For a moment he stared at her as if he didn't recognize her, and Sarah saw the exact moment when reality crashed back over him. "Sarah," he sat up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you? You were having a nightmare." Jacob nodded, not meeting her eyes. "I have them sometimes. I should have warned you." "You don't need to apologize for grieving, Jacob." Sarah sat up too, pulling her shawl around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No." The answer came too quickly, too firmly. "I'm sorry I disturbed your sleep." He started to get up, but Sarah caught his arm. "Jacob, wait, please." He paused but didn't sit back down. "I know you loved her," Sarah said quietly. "I know you loved Martha, and I know losing her and the baby nearly destroyed you. But you're not betraying their memory by letting yourself live again." Jacob's shoulders sagged. "Aren't I? Some days it feels like I am. Some days I catch myself, going hours without thinking about them. And then I feel guilty, like I'm dishonoring what we had." Sarah's heart ached for him. "Oh, Jacob, love isn't a finite resource. Having room in your heart for new feelings doesn't diminish what you felt for Martha." "How can you say that? You've never lost someone you loved that way." The words stung, but Sarah pushed past the hurt. "You're right, I haven't. But I've watched you these past weeks, and I can see how the guilt is eating at you. You're so afraid of moving forward that you're not really living at all." Jacob finally looked at her, and Sarah saw the depth of pain in his blue eyes. "I don't know how to move forward. I don't even know if I want to." "Then don't think about moving forward," Sarah said gently. "Just think about moving through. One day at a time, one moment at a time. You don't have to forget Martha or stop loving her, but maybe you can start letting yourself feel other things too." They sat in silence as the room gradually lightened with the approaching sunrise. Finally, Jacob spoke. "She would have liked you, I think, Martha. She had a kind heart like yours. She would have wanted me to not be so alone." It was the first time Jacob had really talked about his first wife, and Sarah felt honored that he was sharing this with her. "Tell me about her," Sarah said softly. Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "She was small, like you, but where you're strong, she was fragile, I suppose. Delicate. She had the most beautiful laugh, like silver bells. She loved flowers, spent hours in her garden. The house was always full of them in the summer." Sarah looked around the stark bedroom, trying to imagine it filled with the cheerful presence Jacob was describing. She got pregnant 3 years ago, in the spring. She was so happy, so excited. We both were. We'd been trying for children for 5 years, and we'd almost given up hope. Jacob's voice grew rougher. Everything seemed fine at first, but as the months went on, she grew weaker instead of stronger. The midwife said some women just have difficult pregnancies, that she'd be fine once the baby came. Sarah reached out and took his hand, squeezing gently. She went into labor in November, just after the first snow. It was terrible, Sarah. She labored for 2 days, and I could see her getting weaker and weaker. Finally, the baby came, but he wasn't breathing. The cord was wrapped around his neck. Tears were flowing freely down Jacob's cheeks now. Martha held him for a few minutes. She named him Samuel after her father, and then she just faded away, like a candle being blown out. The midwife said she'd lost too much blood, that there was nothing anyone could have done. But I keep thinking, if I'd been stronger, if I'd done something different. Jacob, no. Sarah moved closer to him, taking both his hands in hers. You couldn't have saved them. Sometimes these tragedies just happen, and there's no one to blame. I know that in my head, but my heart. He shook his head. My heart believes I failed them both. Sarah felt tears in her own eyes. You didn't fail them. You loved them completely, and that love is still part of who you are. It always will be. Jacob looked at her with an expression of surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was there and was seeing her clearly for the first time. How did you get to be so wise? He asked softly. I'm not wise. I'm just a woman who cares about her husband and wants to see him heal. The word husband seemed to resonate between them, carrying more weight than it had before. Jacob studied her face, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. You do care, don't you? He said wonderingly. This isn't just about having a place to belong. You actually care about me. Of course I care about you, Jacob. How could you doubt that? Because I haven't given you any reason to. I've been distant, cold, holding you at arm's length because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of feeling something for you and then losing you too. The admission seemed to surprise him. I couldn't survive that again, Sarah. I couldn't go through that kind of loss twice. Sarah felt her heart break and mend all at once. Oh, Jacob, you can't live your whole life afraid of loss. You'll miss all the joy trying to avoid the pain. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. When did this happen? He asked softly. When did what happen? When did you stop being just a convenient arrangement and start being important to me? Sarah felt a flutter of hope in her chest. I don't know. When did it happen for you? Jacob thought about it. Maybe it was when you stood up to the church elders that night, defending yourself with such dignity and fire. Or maybe it was the first morning I came downstairs and smelled coffee and biscuits and realized the house felt alive again. Or maybe it was yesterday when you were hanging laundry and humming that little song, and I realized I'd been looking forward to coming in from the barn just to see you. Sarah's breath caught. Jacob, I'm not saying it's love, he said quickly. I don't know if I'm capable of that anymore, but it's something real and growing, and it scares me. It doesn't have to scare you, Sarah whispered. I'm not going anywhere. You can't promise that. Life doesn't make those kinds of guarantees. No, it doesn't, but I can promise that whatever time we have, I want to spend it really living, not just existing. Don't you? Jacob reached up and touched her face, his rough fingers gentle against her skin. You're so brave, Sarah. Braver than I am. I'm not brave. I'm just tired of being afraid. They sat there as the sun fully rose, lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Jacob spoke again. Would you like me to show you Martha's garden? What's left of it anyway? It's been neglected since she died, but maybe in the spring. I'd like that very much, Sarah said softly. After breakfast, Jacob led her out to what had once been an elaborate flower garden behind the house. Now it was overgrown with weeds and tangled with dead vines, but Sarah could see the bones of what had been a beautiful space. She had roses here, Jacob said, pointing to a section near the house. Pink ones, her favorite, and there were hollyhocks along the fence, and sweet peas climbing up strings she tied between posts. Sarah could picture it, a riot of color and fragrance, a testament to love and hope and the beauty of growing things. Could we restore it? She asked. Together, I mean. I'd like to learn about the flowers she loved. Jacob looked at her with an expression that was part surprise, part gratitude, and part something deeper. You wouldn't feel like you were competing with her memory. Jacob, I could never compete with Martha's memory, and I wouldn't want to, but maybe I could honor it. Maybe we could create something new that still holds pieces of what was beautiful about what came before. Jacob nodded slowly. I'd like that. I think Martha would like it too. That afternoon, Sarah found Jacob in his workshop, carefully crafting what looked like small wooden markers. When she asked what they were for, he showed her two beautifully carved headstones. For Martha and Samuel, he explained. After they died, I couldn't bring myself to make proper markers for their graves. But maybe it's time. Sarah watched him work, seeing the love and grief and healing all flowing through his skilled hands. They're beautiful, Jacob. Will you come with me when I put them in place? Of course. They walked to the small family cemetery behind the church the next Sunday after services, carrying the markers Jacob had made. The graves had been marked only with simple wooden crosses, weathered now by 3 years of season. Jacob knelt beside the graves, carefully positioning the new headstones. Sarah stood behind him, offering silent support as he said his private goodbyes. I want you to know, Jacob said quietly, that I'll always love you both, but I also want you to know that Sarah has brought light back into my life, and I think I'm ready to let that light grow. When he stood, there were tears on his cheeks, but also something that looked like peace. Sarah took his hand, and they walked home together through the crisp winter air. That night, for the first time since their wedding, Jacob moved closer to Sarah in their bed, not to make love, but simply to hold her, to feel the comfort of human connection after months of isolation. Thank you, he whispered in the darkness. For what? For being patient with me, for caring about Martha's memory, for helping me remember that grief and healing can exist in the same heart. Sarah snuggled closer to his warmth. Thank you for letting me in. I love you, Sarah. The words were so quiet, Sarah almost thought she'd imagined them. But when she looked up at Jacob's face in the moonlight streaming through the window, she saw the truth in his eyes. I love you too, she whispered back. It wasn't the passionate declaration of young lovers, but something deeper and more precious. The love of two people who had found each other in their brokenness and chosen to heal together. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the world in fresh possibility. And inside the Brenneman house, two hearts that had been frozen with fear and grief began to thaw in the warmth of genuine, hard-won love. Spring was still months away, but Sarah could already feel it coming. 1 year later, Sarah stood in Martha's restored garden, her hands covered in rich earth, as she carefully transplanted the last of the rose bushes. The spring of 1996 had arrived early, and Cedar Valley was bursting with new life. Green shoots pushing through the soil, birds returning from their winter journeys, and everywhere the sweet promise of renewal. The garden was more beautiful than Sarah had ever imagined it could be. She and Jacob had spent countless hours over the winter, planning and preparing, poring over seed catalogs, and sharing dreams of what they wanted to create together. The result was a harmonious blend of Martha's original vision and Sarah's own touches. The pink roses Martha had loved now grew alongside Sarah's favorite lavender, and the hollyhock stood tall next to sunflowers that would tower over everything by summer's end. It's perfect. Sarah turned to find Jacob watching her from the garden gate, his face soft with emotion. In the past year, the lines of grief around his eyes had gradually been replaced by laugh lines, and the stooped shoulders of a man carrying too much sorrow had straightened into the proud bearing of someone who had learned to hope again. "Do you really think so?" Sarah asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "I think Martha would be amazed, and I think she'd be grateful that her garden is being tended by someone who loves it as much as she did." Sarah walked over to where Jacob stood, and he automatically opened his arms to embrace her. It had become second nature, this easy affection between them. What had started as careful politeness had grown into deep friendship, then genuine love, and finally the kind of partnership Sarah had always dreamed of, but never dared hope for. "There's something else," Jacob said, his voice slightly nervous. "Something I want to show you." He led her to the far corner of the garden, where he'd been working on a special project for weeks. There, nestled among the flowering shrubs, stood a small wooden bench with an inscription carved into the back, in memory of Martha and Samuel Brenneman, and in celebration of love that continues to grow. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "Jacob, it's beautiful. I thought we could sit here sometimes, to remember them, but also to celebrate what we've built together. Is that all right?" Instead of answering with words, Sarah stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. It was a kiss full of love and gratitude and the joy of two people who had found their way to each other through the darkest of times. When they broke apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I have something else to tell you." Jacob's hands moved to rest on Sarah's still flat stomach, and his smile grew wide. "Dr. Henderson confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby." Sarah's hands flew to cover his, her eyes wide with wonder. "Are you sure?" "He's sure. Due in late October, he thinks." Sarah burst into tears, happy tears this time, tears of joy and disbelief, and overwhelming gratitude. They'd been trying for a baby for months, hoping and praying but not quite daring to believe it would really happen. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "We're really going to be parents?" "We really are." Jacob's own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I know it's scary after what happened before." "It is scary," Sarah admitted, "but it's also wonderful. This baby is going to be so loved, Jacob, by both of us, and by the memory of the siblings who came before." Jacob held her close, and they stood there in Martha's garden, their garden now, surrounded by the promise of spring and the miracle of new life growing within Sarah. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," Jacob said softly. "When Martha died, I thought my chance at happiness died with her. I thought I was destined to just exist until it was my time to join her. And now I know that the heart is bigger than I ever imagined, big enough to hold old love and new love, grief and joy, memory and hope." "You taught me that, Sarah." Sarah pulled back to look at him, this man who had become her whole world. "You taught me something too." "What's that?" "You taught me that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest soil, that love can bloom even after everything seems lost." They sat together on the new memorial bench, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded their farm. In the distance, Sarah could see the lights beginning to twinkle in the windows of Cedar Valley's homes, where families were gathering for evening meals and children were being tucked into bed with stories and lullabies. "Do you ever wonder," Sarah asked, "what would have happened if I hadn't been brave enough to come to you that morning?" Jacob considered the question. "I think I would have spent the rest of my life as half a man, going through the motions but never really living. And you, probably still in Ohio, working as some relative's unpaid housekeeper, growing old and bitter and alone. Instead, we're here, together, about to become a family." Sarah leaned against Jacob's shoulder, marveling at how perfectly she fit there. "The community seems to have forgiven me for my scandalous behavior." Jacob chuckled. "Marrying a widower twice your age after proposing to him yourself? Yes, I think they've decided you're appropriately reformed. Esther Yuda actually complimented my apple pie at church last Sunday. The ultimate sign of acceptance." They laughed together, remembering the dark days when Sarah's reputation had been in ruins, and Jacob had been drowning in grief. It seemed impossible now that they had ever been those broken, desperate people. "I got a letter from Ruth today," Sarah said. "She's being courted by the Miller boy from the next district over. Young Thomas. He's a good man. She'll be happy. She wants me to help her plan the wedding. She said she hopes she can be half as happy in her marriage as I am in mine." Jacob turned to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "Are you happy, Sarah? Really happy? Not just content or grateful, but truly happy?" Sarah thought about it, taking inventory of her life. She had a home filled with love and laughter, a husband who cherished her, a community that had welcomed her back into the fold, and a baby growing beneath her heart. Most importantly, she had found her purpose, not just as a wife and soon-to-be mother, but as the woman who had helped heal a broken man and brought joy back into a house that had known only sorrow. "I'm happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said honestly. "Even in my girlhood fantasies, I never imagined love could feel like this, safe and passionate and peaceful, all at once." "I feel the same way," Jacob said softly. "You saved my life, Sarah, not just my reputation or my loneliness, but my actual life. I was dying inside, and you brought me back." "We saved each other," Sarah corrected. "That's what real love does. It rescues and heals and makes both people better than they were before." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jacob helped Sarah to her feet. "Come on, Mrs. Brenneman. Let's go inside and start planning for our future." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the house, leaving the garden to bloom in the moonlight. The path ahead of them was uncertain. There would be challenges, joys, sorrows, and triumphs yet to come, but they would face it all together. Two people who had learned that the most precious things in life often come disguised as desperate measures and impossible hopes. Behind them, the roses Martha had planted years ago released their sweet fragrance into the night air, blessing the love story that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. And somewhere in the darkness, it seemed as though the very air shimmered with approval, as if those who had gone before were smiling down on the beautiful life that had been built from their memory. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, marking another day's end in Cedar Valley. But for Sarah and Jacob Brenneman, it felt much more like a beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, and someday, God willing, it would bring the cries of a baby taking his first breath in a house filled with love. For now, though, it was enough to walk into their future together, hearts full of gratitude for the winding path that had led them to each other, and souls at peace with the knowledge that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest words, "Take me as your wife." And in the gentle spring darkness of rural Pennsylvania, two hearts that had been broken by life and mended by love beat in perfect rhythm, writing the final chapter of their courtship and the first page of their forever.